Thanks so much, Aruni. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. My name is David Buckley. I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here in the Political Science Department at the University of Louisville, where I also direct the Center for Asian Democracy, which is thrilled to get to partner with everyone this evening to bring this excellent conversation together. I do want to thank everyone at the Authoritarianism team. I want to thank Ambassador Sedgwick in particular for his great partnership on this event. When we had interest in bringing Mr. Banbury to campus originally, I had no idea of the close working relationship between IFAS and Todd, and so was so grateful to see this event come together. Thanks also to my team at the Center for Asian Democracy, especially Emily and Andrew, for all that you do to make us show up in the right place at the right time. The Center for Asian Democracy is honored to be able to convene our annual lecture in Asian democracy for the 2025-26 academic year this evening as part of the Sedgwick series. This lecture in the past has hosted leading human rights advocates like Harry Wu, diplomats like Derek Mitchell, investigative journalists like Patricia Evangelista, and we are so excited to add to that tradition tonight with one of the world's leading experts on democracy and governance. Briefly, for those not familiar with our work, the Center for Asian Democracy is actually entering its 20th year on U of L's campus. We fund award-winning faculty research. We mentor excellent students at the undergraduate and graduate level as they enter into their careers in international affairs. We engage with community partners here in Louisville and in Kentuckiana, and we convene policymakers and other practitioners, including colleagues from IFAS, to put academic research into context and conversation with those actually working for a more democratic Asia. There are rack cards that you should have had at your seats with information on how to get more information, with a QR code that can help you get more information about CAD and stay in touch about future events. As you'll hear today, we're going to talk about thorny topics in international affairs, relevant to the United States to be sure, but relevant more broadly to those who care about democracy, rights, and ultimately human flourishing. These are urgent, practical challenges, both for international organizations like the UN and closer to home for civil society organizations, including in our own community, working to strengthen democracy. We're very honored to be hosting Mr. Anthony Banbury for our discussion this evening. We're talking with him because of his deep experience in the practical work of strengthening democracy and governance, in particular across Asia. In the last 2 decades, scholars have noted what they now refer to as democratic backsliding across the world, including Asia and North America. Today, democracy generally does not deteriorate at the end of a military coup. Instead, it is weakened from within, hollowed out as checks and balances deteriorate, law enforcement scrutiny is brought against civil society, and regulatory decisions constrain freedom of the press. Despite these pressures, average citizens remain willing to rally and sacrifice for democracy in inspiring ways, both here in the United States and across the world in countries like South Korea, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka, which all saw large-scale political protests in favor of democracy and rights just within the last 2 years. International practitioners maintain an important role in this work, and we're so grateful to have Tony to lend his perspective to understanding that work in a difficult environment today. Without any further ado, let me introduce Mr. Tony Banbury. He joined the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFAS, as President and Chief Executive Officer in 2018. I'll let Tony say more about the nuts and bolts of IFAS's work, but it is a world leader in strengthening elections around the globe, a role that has never been more urgent across Asia and beyond. Prior to joining IFAS, Tony had an extensive career working with the United Nations and the United States government, perhaps most notably working on the UN's first ever emergency health mission in response to the 2014 West African Ebola crisis. He previously served as the Asia Regional Director for the UN World Food Program, where he oversaw operations in 14 Asian countries, including Afghanistan and North Korea, and led that organization's responses to the Indian Ocean tsunami and Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. He, previous to his experience at the UN, had worked for the U.S. National Security Council and is one of our country's great advocates for democracy and rights. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tony Banbury.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be in Louisville and among all of you this evening. Thank you so much for coming. I want to start by thanking the Center for Asian Democracy of the University of Louisville and its director, Dave Buckley. Dave, thank you not just for the kind introduction, but really for your partnership with IFAS in an area where you've shown some unique attributes as a scholar, not just of religion and politics, but religion and elections, doing some very cutting edge work. And it's great to work with you on that. I also want to thank Dr. Lewis and the Filson Historical Society for hosting me, and of course, the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute. Thank you, Aruni. And then finally, I especially want to thank Todd Sedgwick and Christy Brown for being my host here and showing me such warm Kentucky hospitality, and especially for always, through your commitment and passion to democracy in our country and abroad, always inspiring me to do more and to do better. And I'm so grateful to you for your friendship. Thank you. It's really an honor for me to be here delivering the 2026 annual lecture on Asian democracy as part of the Theodore Sedgwick Distinguished Lecture Series. As mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFAS. For more than 3 decades, since we were established in 1987, IFAS was an election assistance organization, technical election assistance organization. And then in 2019, with leadership of our board and particularly Ambassador Sedgwick, IFAS transitioned from an elections organization to a democracy organization. And the challenges that I will be discussing today, the struggle between democracy and autocracy, are at the heart of why we made that big change. IFAS has worked in more than 145 countries in all regions of the world, and the Asia Pacific region has traditionally always been our largest by program size. However, last year, we lost over 70% of our funding due to reductions in U.S. foreign assistance. It was a difficult year for democracy organizations around the world, international ones, national ones in countries where we work. But IFAS has stabilized thanks to support from other governments, foundations, and private individuals. Our work continues, and as I believe my remarks will show, this work of providing democracy support around the world is more important now than it has ever been. Although I am now running a democracy organization, long before I was a democracy guy, I was an Asian guy. I became intrigued by Asia as an undergraduate in college when I started studying the human rights situation of Cambodians who had fled the Khmer Rouge or the Vietnamese occupation and were living in camps along the Thai-Cambodian border. After I graduated, I bought a one-way ticket to Bangkok, never having been anywhere other than North America and Europe, because I wanted to go work in those camps with Cambodians promoting human rights. Stepping off that plane in Don Mueang Airport in Bangkok in 1988, having grown up in New England, being hit by that monsoon heat and humidity is an experience I will never forget. After I got to Thailand and a lot of pestering of the United Nations, they thankfully finally hired me as a human rights officer who had no relevant skills or experience in Asia or with Cambodians, mind you. The camps along the border, for those of you who probably don't remember this because it's a long time ago, they were run by something called the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea. It was an interesting construct. It was made up of the former Khmer Rouge, the Royalists, the Funchonpek Party, led by Prince Ranarid, and the Republican remnants of the Lon Nol regime, the Khmer People's National Liberation Front. Working on human rights in those camps taught me some early, difficult, but important lessons about how rulers can be quick to abuse power in order to retain it, and the extent to which they will go to avoid being subjected to accountable or democratic governance. After 2 years in the camps and a break for grad school, I then went to Cambodia as part of the United Nations' first ever post-Cold War multi-dimensional peacekeeping mission, when they wanted to do elections and human rights and civil affairs and policing. It was a fascinating time. And in Cambodia, in 1992 and 93, I saw the entire apparatus of the state put at the disposal of a single political party, the Cambodian People's Party, CPP. And I saw the state's apparatus used to kill political opponents, torture them, subject them to unjust imprisonment, and otherwise really crush any hope of political opposition. I have to say, as a young man doing human rights work, it was very jarring to see literally political people running for office, particularly from the Funcinpec party, killed in their homes. The bodies there, their wives grieving over them, young children, and it happened again and again. And the tactic used by the CPP at the time was not to kill every Funcinpec opposition member, but enough of them to send a strong signal to others that you better be quiet. But when the killing and intimidation was not enough to silence the voices of Cambodians who yearned to have the royal family return to rule the country, the whole world saw the results of an election administered by the United Nations that produced a winner, the Funcinpec Party, with those results ignored by the CPP's ruler, Hun Sen, who would go on to rule Cambodia for the next 30 years, eventually handing over reins to his son just a few years ago in 2023. These early experiences in Asia with unaccountable authoritarian rule and widespread severe human rights abuses were formative for me. I left Asia in 1993 and returned a decade later, as Dave mentioned, as the regional director for the UN World Food Program. I tell you, if you ever have the opportunity to take that job, grab it. It was a great job. Based in Bangkok, responsible for 14 countries, it varied, 14 to 16, throughout the region. I had the immense privilege of traveling all over Asia for 6 years, and not just to the capitals for formal meetings, though there were plenty of those, but to the most remote corners of these countries, where the poor and most food insecure people tended to live, the most furthest reaches. And there I was able to learn so much about the aspirations, the hopes, and the challenges of the masses of Asia, the common people of Asia. I drove all over North Korea on multiple visits, which was fascinating and time, another perhaps story. And traveled to the Tibetan inhabited regions of Western China, not to Tibet proper, but the Tibetan inhabited regions, and all over Myanmar and so many more places. Those experiences combined with my others in Asia really formed who I was and what I wanted to do as a professional. I could go on about my attachment to Asia, but that's not why you're here, and I'm sure you don't want me to. I say all this, though, to be transparent and let you know that I come at the issue of democracy in Asia, the struggle of people to have their rights and freedoms respected, from a perspective and a set of experiences that has been as personal as it has been impactful for me. I'm honored here today to stand before you in the same place as Dr. Baidul Alam Majumdar stood last year delivering this annual lecture. And he talked about Bangladesh's monsoon revolution and the subsequent efforts to rebuild its democracy following the 2024 popular uprising. Just 2 months ago, Bangladesh conducted successful historic elections overseen by Dr. Baidul, who delivered that lecture, and where IFES provided important support. IFES has had the privilege of working closely with Dr. Baidul over many years, and we hosted him at our offices in Washington on his same visit to the US when he visited you here. The title of our discussion today is a question that defines our current global era between democracy and authoritarianism in Asia. Who is winning and what comes next. Across Asia and increasingly across the world, we are seeing autocratic leaders consolidate power, restrict civil liberties, manipulate elections, and hollow out institutions that are designed to hold those leaders accountable. But at the same time, we see citizens, often young citizens, university students, taking extraordinary risks to demand dignity, voice, good governance, and basic political freedoms. And in many countries in Asia, this is making a critical difference. So this evening, I want to break down the question on whether democracy is winning or losing and explore three core issues with you: the status of democracy in Asia today, how autocrats are adapting, using both old and new methods to stay in power, and most importantly, how people and institutions are pushing back and what it will take to tilt the balance toward democracy again. This is not a story of inevitable decline or triumph. It is a story of a very high-stakes struggle, one whose outcome in country after country is far from assured. While my remarks will focus on Asia, it is important to situate the struggle between democracy and authoritarian in its broader global context. And here the news, as I think you all know, is not good. Globally, autocratic rule has surged dramatically over the past 2 decades, using collaboration and other tactics to co-opt democracy's core values and institutions. According to the latest report from the Variety of Democracies Institute, or VDEM, which is based in the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and publishes a very well-regarded annual report on the state of democracy in the world, the share of people living in autocratic rule in 2025 was 74%. That compares with 50% in 2005. Just think of that. 3 out of 4 of our fellow human beings are living under some form of autocracy. And the percent of the world's population living in a liberal democracy is just 7%. 74% versus 7%. Let me share a few more statistics to put into perspective what has happened globally over the past couple decades. The world today, according to VDEM, has 92 autocracies and 87 democracies. Democracy is back to 1978 levels for the average global citizen. The gains of the so-called third wave of democratization that started in Portugal in 1974 have been almost eradicated. In 2005, 12 countries were on an autocratizing path, headed in the wrong direction. In 2025, that number was 44. In 2005, freedom of expression was worsening in 7 countries. In 2025, that number is 44 again. In 2005, the quality of elections, something IFES cares deeply about, was deteriorating in 11 countries. In 2025, it was deteriorating in 2022. If IFES is judged on how we're helping countries improve their elections, my board member here, Ambassador Sedgwick, should fire me on the spot, because we haven't been doing a very good job if that's the metric. There are now more people living in closed autocracies, the lowest level, 28% of the world's population, than in electoral and liberal democracies. If we combine electoral democracies and liberal democracies, that's 26% of the population of the world. Clearly, democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism is a global trend that is impacting all regions of the world. And in Asia, it is on vivid display. According to VDEM's categorization, 4 of the 5 most populous countries in the world are currently classified as either an electoral autocracy, which is basically a country that has elections but isn't really democratic, either as an electoral autocracy or a closed autocracy, and all 4 are in Asia. India, China, Indonesia, and Pakistan. Of course, there are many nuances within these countries and between these categorizations. India and Indonesia are backsliding from their prior status as electoral democracies, and Pakistan has been an entrenched electoral autocracy for some time, and China, of course, is a closed autocracy. VDEM also highlights sustained democratic backsliding in the Philippines, Thailand, and, of course, Cambodia, which just goes from bad to worse. Again, to add some nuance, Thailand and the Philippines, while categorized as electoral autocracies, still hold competitive elections, and a reversal of trends in those countries is easy to imagine. At least for me, it is, and we're hopeful about what will happen there, while Cambodia is on a trajectory to becoming a closed autocracy. So what is happening in these backsliding or autocratizing countries? In the past, as Dave mentioned, democratic governments tended to be overthrown through military coups and sudden, dramatic, changing events. That still occurs at times, as was the case in Myanmar in 2021, immediately following democratic elections. IFES was heavily involved in supporting those historic elections in Myanmar. And right afterward, the military grabbed power and used to justify its power grab that the elections had been flawed, which was not at all the case. But they targeted the election commission and arrested the members of the election commission with whom we had worked so closely, and our country director and his wife and young children had to flee the country, literally flee the country for fear of being locked up. While coups have not totally gone away, it is now increasingly common for autocrats to come to power not through the barrel of a gun, but rather through legitimate democratic elections. But then once they are in power, they co-opt and weaken the institutions of democratic government meant to constrain them. There's a very well-established authoritarian playbook that is extremely effective and has been used again and again in countries in Asia around the world. And there's some basic plays in this playbook that the authoritarians run again and again. Remove independent-minded judges and replace them with pliant ones. Install cronies to run elections. Jail opposition leaders on trumped-up charges. Make illegal opposition political parties. Censor and control the media. Squeeze civil society. And use emergency powers to pursue this set of plays through extra constitutional means. These are tried and true tactics used to great effect time and again. Let's look at a few recent examples of how this authoritarian playbook has been deployed across Asia, starting with electoral manipulation. Just like governments used to be overthrown in coups, elections used to be stolen by stuffing ballot boxes. That is rarely the case these days. Instead, a variety of methods are used to manipulate election outcomes before election day. These include many of the points I mentioned earlier. It's hard for an opposition politician to win an election if he or she is in jail, or for a party to gain a majority if they're not allowed to appear on a ballot box. But there are other methods as well to manipulate elections. Illicit political finance, abuse of state resources, putting the resources of the state, staff of ministries, cars, money, communications capabilities at the disposal of the ruling party. Another method, targeted disenfranchisement of groups of people known to support the opposition. Cambodia has regularly had elections for the past 34 years, but opposition parties have never been given a fair chance to compete. Leading opposition political figures, people like Sam Rainsy, Musukua, Kem Sokha, all people whom I've met, have been systematically persecuted and either jailed or forced to flee the country, or both. In Indonesia, in the past few years, Indonesia, a country that had been really seen as a beacon of democracy in Southeast Asia and beyond, recently institutions such as the Anti-Corruption Commission and the Constitutional Court and civil society and the media have all come under significant pressure from the executive. In 2023, the Constitutional Court, whose Chief Justice just happened to be the brother-in-law of the president, issued a controversial ruling that all legal scholars essentially said was extra-constitutional, but the ruling created an exception to the Constitution's minimum age requirement for the position of vice president, and that ruling then allowed the president's son to be a candidate for vice president in the upcoming elections. I visited Indonesia before the 2019 and 2024 presidential elections. During that latter visit, I was so struck by the changed atmosphere. I met with several pro-democracy leaders, advocates, members of the press, and we sat around having a very frank conversation. And they all were afraid. They were all engaged in self-censorship. They said that in around the 2019 elections, they were willing to and did write op-eds in the press and had very political Facebook postings. And they were all now in 2024 censoring themselves for fear of what would happen if they spoke up as leading members of civil society. That is such a poignant or striking example of how democracy is gradually eroded through these intangible ways. Another powerful tool of autocrats is the expansion of censorship laws and regulations. Hong Kong is an especially egregious case that I think we're all familiar with, but I think sometimes we tend to forget that just a few years ago, Hong Kong was a thriving democracy. However, Beijing has systematically dismantled all elements of that democracy. Beijing's imposition of the national security law dramatically broadened the definitions of treason, espionage, sedition, and heightened a pervasive climate of fear and enabled widespread repression. In just a few short years, Hong Kong has gone from a functioning democracy with strong legal protections, free elections, a political opposition, a free press, and independent institutions to a repressive regime that has eviscerated all aspects of democracy from society, and where independent voices like Jimmy Lai are forced to flee or are locked up. In Myanmar, in addition to the military onslaught unleashed against opposition groups, the military regime passed a cybersecurity law mandating data retention, restricting virtual private networks, VPNs, and codifying censorship power, making even minor expressions of dissent through WhatsApp groups, for instance, very dangerous. The country uses surveillance systems to arrest citizens for dissent and internet shutdowns to block communication apps such as Signal and WhatsApp. Taken together, these examples show how modern authoritarianism often advances not through dramatic ruptures or overnight coups, but through legalistic, incremental measures that hollow out democratic competition from within. These autocratic governments do not operate in silos. Strengthening transnational ties with other autocracies like China and Russia provides large investments in infrastructure, such as mass surveillance systems and weaponry, and a veer of international legitimacy. In a particularly extreme case of have you no shame, China and Russia have sent election observers to Cambodia and Myanmar elections. Chinese so-called experts have helped Myanmar administer the most recent elections. And in turn, Russia has invited friendly observers to its most recent presidential elections, though it did not invite OSCE election monitors, even though Russia is a member of the OSCE. This mimicking of democratic practices to legitimize autocratic incumbents and sham elections shows that even autocrats recognize the popular appeal of democracy. IFAS's Democratic Resilience Lab, which is basically staffed by academic experts or experts with a strong academic bent, I should say. They have written extensively about how modern authoritarians are collaborating through formal organizations and informal channels to stabilize or entrench their rule, disrupt democratic civil society, and extend the reach of repressive institutions beyond state boundaries. Autocrats are collaborating globally, and many Asian countries are serving as testing grounds for their repressive tools. Let's look a little bit more closely at China's influence. Unlike Russia, China actually has an alternative model that it is offering societies, countries, leaders around the world. Russia simply seeks to destroy Western values, European values, break systems down, weaken societies. China is offering a positive, in their mind, alternative model of strong central control, repression of political opposition, and economic growth fueled by infrastructure investment and corruption. Unfortunately, this alternative model often finds adherents, particularly among political elites. It's a pretty good deal if you're running a country to follow that model and see a very sustained period of your rule while you and your cronies get richer and richer. This alternative model has a special appeal in many countries among the elites in Asia and Africa. China's export of AI-driven surveillance infrastructure is equipping regimes to preemptively identify and dismantle opposition networks. China's Digital Silk Road initiative enables Beijing to ensure long-term leverage over the countries that adopt its defense, information, and telecommunication technologies. For example, the Chinese government has the legal authority to force technology companies to route foreign data back to Beijing, hand over encryption keys, or activate hidden hardware and software backdoors to monitor or disrupt exported systems. And then there's the information space. We all think of Russia leading massive coordinated disinformation campaigns designed to exploit existing domestic grievances and undermine trust in democratic systems around the world. And indeed, they do that. But China is using the very same tactics. During the 2024 presidential elections in Taiwan, Beijing flooded the information space and social media platforms, especially TikTok, with inauthentic accounts, fake news to undermine the ruling party, making use of deepfakes of candidates, falsified official documents, and AI-generated avatars spreading pro-Beijing narratives. And just what Beijing did in Taiwan, Moscow did recently in Bulgaria, in Hungary, and in Moldova in their recent elections. China and Russia also engage in so-called narrative laundering. This involves paying local PR firms, media influencers, and setting up fake local news domains to push authoritarian or anti-Western narratives. Many times that's not even legal. Hiring a PR campaign or PR firm to conduct communications efforts for a political party is a tactic that's been around not just decades, but hundreds of years probably, and is widely used in this country. And so the techniques used to undermine democratic opposition are sometimes legal, very often hard to understand or put a finger on, and impossible to prosecute at times. Imagine if the money is offshore and it's used to hire a communications or PR firm of some kind offshore that is using servers that are offshore but are targeting the residents of, say, Taiwan. How does a prosecutor even pursue a case there? How does the law keep up with that? Russia has signed several media cooperation agreements in recent years aiming to supposedly train foreign journalists on Russian perspectives of global affairs. There's always a money element involved in these kinds of transactions. And in Japan, Russia is leveraging pro-action actors in the far right to spread different disinformation and pro-Kremlin messaging, particularly about the invasion of Ukraine. For authoritarian countries, this can be a prime opportunity to directly influence public opinion in places where it is to their advantage to promote anti-Western, anti-democratic, anti-EU narratives and values at very low cost. While autocrats are collaborating and funding each other, the champions of democracy are facing a devastating resource crisis. The US retrenchment from democracy promotion is accelerating these dynamics. In 2025, as is well known, the United States administration decided to dismantle the US Agency for International Development and end almost all democracy, human rights, and governance programs around the world. The United States had been not only the leading funder, but the leading voice in support of political opposition parties, independent media, civil society organizations, the elements that are essential to holding leaders accountable, the elements essential for democracy. The US funding for all that, or 98% or something, ended. But almost as important, and perhaps even more important, the US voice in support of that work ended. And at times, the US voice has been used to even undermine that work. IFES had to close 19 of our 34 offices in countries around the world. And many of those offices that remained open had to shrink to a much smaller size following the end of US funding. Programs of IFES and other organizations to support election administration, political campaign, finance transparency, participatory democracy, electoral judicial trainings, and much more were canceled overnight. Local civil society organizations and independent media in countries around the world were obliged to dramatically scale back their work, and many did not survive. Many were forced to close. It's not just international NGOs like IFES that were impacted, but the US funded so many small national, local civil society organizations that were doing really important work. And the US backing for them gave them a degree of protection from attack by the government. And when the US funding was withdrawn and when that shield was withdrawn, they became much more vulnerable. Other leading donor governments have retreated as well, including leading European governments and Japan. Many European governments have felt obliged to shift funding from foreign assistance to security due to challenges within NATO, due to the Ukrainian war, the threat posed by Russia. These governments are making quite understandable decisions to increase their investment in their defense spending. That money has to come from somewhere, and in very constrained budgetary environments, often the first place they look is their foreign aid budgets. The United Kingdom, for instance, just within the past few months, formalized a decision that it had made a few months earlier to reduce their foreign assistance from 0.05% of GNI to 0.03%. So a 40% reduction in their foreign assistance. And not only are the foreign aid budgets shrinking, but priorities within those budgets are shifting to take into account current realities. And many of these donor governments are, again, prioritizing Ukraine for foreign assistance, not just security considerations. They are prioritizing large humanitarian emergencies in countries like Sudan and DR Congo, and they are prioritizing climate change. So unlike the US, these donor countries still all rhetorically support democracy and talk about how it's important for them as a priority. But when it comes to their funding euros, the funding has really been reduced. Fortunately, Australia is an exception to that and has sustained its foreign aid budget and its funding for democracy, including and especially in the Asia Pacific region. And Australia is our largest donor in that region. IFAS's surveys, reports, and interviews, though, with civil society organizations around the world have revealed the severe negative impacts of some of these funding cuts that I was just talking about in Asia. And as pro-democracy forces get weakened, autocratic actors get not only relatively stronger because of the weakening of their opponents, but also absolutely stronger as they exploit their opponent's misfortune. I will share one example of the impact of that rollback of the United States verbal support, reputational support for democracy that I heard just yesterday, actually. And Todd, you'll have to forgive me for this, but when Ambassador Sedgwick was ambassador to the Slovak Republic, the president of the country was doing something that we see a lot of autocrats do. He was trying to force out independent-minded judges and replace them with pliant cronies. And he was trying to use sham disciplinary charges for misbehavior that these judges had allegedly engaged in. Well, when the disciplinary hearings were taking place, they were open to the public, and Ambassador Sedgwick and some of his fellow and other ambassadors from European countries would show up at these disciplinary hearings to send the message that the United States was watching, these other countries were watching. And that involvement of the United States and other democracies puts a brake, a check on the power or the political willingness of autocratic leaders to go after independent institutions, election commissions, civil society. With the US stepping back from that role in countries around the world, it is absolutely devastating. But I do not stand before you today just to read an obituary for democracy. No, because amid these threats, democracy champions in many cases, are showing great resilience, including, of course, in Asia. In Bangladesh in 2024, young people took to the streets in response to long simmering frustration with the autocratic ruler, Sheikh Hasina, who had ruled the country like a personal fiefdom for 15 years. She had basically eviscerated all real substantive aspects of Bangladeshi democracy. And the spark that lit the flame was her decision to make it much harder for her political opponents to get access to government jobs. She wanted to pass a law that was written in a way that basically made it that privileged her supporters in access to government jobs. And those jobs in that corrupted economy at the time were one of the only hopes that especially college students had to have a decent livelihood. Well, this decision of hers prompted protests, particularly among college students who came out into the streets. Sheikh Hasina unleashed the security forces against the protesters. Many people were killed. The protests grew. More people were killed. Sheikh Hasina pressed the military to do more. And finally, after around 1,400 Bangladeshis, many of them young people, were slaughtered, the military decided enough was enough and told Sheikh Hasina she had to leave the country, and she fled to India. When When I traveled to Dhaka just a couple months after that, in October, after the August uprising, I had dinner with several leaders of civil society, leading journalists and editors, and the dinner was hosted by a retired general. I was so struck by the anger of these leading figures of society toward Sheikh Hasina and all her collaborators who had for 15 years oppressed members from all segments of society. There were people, journalists who had been jailed and tortured who were at the dinner. And the general, my host, I was sitting across the table from him, a very proper, accomplished gentleman, um, was literally tearing up, describing how he felt about the behavior of the government across 15 years. And I think that really reflected how society as a whole felt. And even more than anger, what they were feeling and demanding was justice. They were absolutely committed to seeing the perpetrators of those killings of the young people brought to justice. The rupture in Bangladeshi society caused by Sheikh Hasina's autocratization, sorry, is certainly deep and will take a long time to heal. But during the period of interim government uh, led by Nobel Prize winner Mohammed Yunus, Bangladeshi society took a lot of steps to start to rebuild its democracy. Already when I was there, various reform commissions had been established and were being led by prominent figures from civil society. Constitutional reform, legal reform, electoral reform, police reform, and there was such a strong commitment to turn their backs on that period of autocracy and really usher in a new period of democracy. And they had these very successful elections overseen, as I mentioned, by the previous speaker at this annual lecture, Dr. Baidul. And that's a really encouraging sign. In 2025, somewhat analogously, in Nepal, the Gen Z protests erupted, also born out of long-standing frustration by ruling elite. And they were triggered by systemic corruption and a social media ban, which of course young people rebelled against, and that got the youth out into the streets. Again, violence, conflict, and the prime minister, who was in his fourth term as prime minister, a 74-year-old gentleman, stepped down. Like in Bangladesh, the interim government ushered in a whole new set of faces. They organized elections. The elections were recently conducted. And the newly elected prime minister is a 35-year-old former, or maybe current, rapper. It's a whole new set of faces from the prime minister on down. A number of new people who had never been involved in politics or run for office in the past have been elected to parliament. A number of people from segments of society who don't normally participate in politics are now in parliament as part of the sweeping victory of the RSP party. In 2022, street protests in Sri Lanka presented a classic case of much of what I've been talking about. China was deeply involved in the Sri Lankan economy, big infrastructure investments, a lot of corruption, great benefit to some of the elites in the government, while the economy of the country deteriorated and the ability of people, parents, to put food on the plates for their children became increasingly difficult. The Chinese investments certainly had outsized benefits for the Rajapaksa family. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, his brother, and their brother Basil Rajapaksa, the finance minister. Now, that's a pretty good deal when three brothers can occupy those positions, at least for them. But in response to growing opposition to their rule and blatant corruption and poor governance, the protesters started coming out in the streets, and the response was a classic overreach by authoritarians. They declared a state of emergency, imposed curfews, limited access to social media, and they unleashed their own violent supporters on the protesters. We all saw video or TV images of protesters ending up in the president's residence, and so came the end of the Rajapaksa regime. In Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, frustration with the autocratic behavior, the overreach of autocrats, frustration with their blatant widespread corruption, and frustration with poor economies where the living condition of the average person just kept deteriorating was what was so mobilizing for the democratic forces to rise up against these authoritarian leaders. And there are other good news stories for democracy supporters in Asia. Just in Taiwan in 2024, the elections went so well despite such concerted effort by the Chinese, and the Taiwanese made an enormous investment through their Ministry for Digital Security, I think it's called, to counter the misinformation campaigns coming out of Beijing. Malaysia has successfully preserved its democratic institutions through a combination of judicial independence and a very active civil society media and competitive elections. In the 2018 elections, the opposition built a strong coalition and ended 61 years of rule of the main party, the Barisan Nasional Party. In Indonesia, the new president, President Prabowo, sought to militarize important civilian positions in the government, regional governors and such. President Prabowo is well known as a general involved in some less, well, let's just say he was not given a visa to the United States because of his human rights abuses before. Now he has one. And then there were widespread street protests against the Prabowo administration. And Timor-Leste, of course, is a bright spot and has repeatedly had democratic resilience in elections and shown resilience even as such a new nation. So how can we tilt the balance toward democracy? How can we reverse rising authoritarianism? How do we turn these sparks of resistance into something durable, that institutions can withstand pressure and where the democracies can deliver for people over time? Going back to VDOM, its research has found some common factors among the countries that have bounced back from authoritarian trends. The most important characteristics, the three most important characteristics of a successful bounce back are robust collective action, including unified political opposition and civil society mobilization. Secondly, institutional safeguards that protect critical independent institutions, especially the judiciary and election commissions. And thirdly, international support, including through targeted democracy assistance and diplomatic pressure of the likes that Ambassador Sedgwick was exercising in order to catalyze pro-democratic forces on the ground. VDEM's data also shows that after freedom of expression, the most frequent targets of autocratizing leaders are, not surprisingly, constraints on executive power, the rule of law, judicial independence, and institutional checks and balances. While every country is, of course, unique, the above points provide a good starting point for a roadmap for democracy supporters as they seek to counter authoritarianism in Asia and around the world. Organizations like IFES know how to build these roadmaps to do this work, always in partnership with others. We can't do anything on our own. Of course, though, we need resources to do the work, and the US funding cuts, as I've mentioned, have been so devastating. IFA spent many years working with election commissions and civil society in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and we like to believe we contributed in some modest ways over the years to building the technical skills of election administrators and the commitment to democratic values of large swaths of society in those countries. In the end, though, it is up to the people of a country to decide who their leaders are. As I conclude today, my call to action is clear. Democracy is being seriously threatened, without a doubt. The percentage of everyday citizens living without democratic governance in Asia is at its highest point in decades. The threat is real, the stakes are high, and complacency is not an option. Democracy, though, is fighting back and is being reinvented, particularly by young people in Asia and around the globe who are demanding dignity, accountability, freedom, and a future worth believing in. The examples I mentioned today show how civic mobilization, political will, and strong institutions can counter authoritarian power grabs and dismantle deep-rooted structures that perpetrate injustices and abuse of power. Brave democracy champions are showing that systems can be reinvented and democracy can reemerge even when it seems implausible. We all know our democratic systems need improvement, but we also know they are worthy of our care and our labor. The solution to society's problems is not self-serving autocrats. It is a shared commitment to making democracy work better for everyone throughout Asia and around the world, at home and abroad. That work belongs to all of us. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Tony, for those remarks. Really fantastic. I see that we already have a bunch of great questions in the chat, so I'll be keeping an eye on those. If there's anyone who would like a piece of paper to write down a question on, you could throw a hand in the air and one of my colleagues could bring you a note card. Or if we have enough time, we may have some time to circulate a mic too, but we do have a full agenda, so maybe we could just get started with some of these. One question that a couple of people have also, I think, upvoted here puts a finger on the changing role of the US in the region and more broadly around the globe right now. In this age of authoritarianism here at home, have you seen the United States' role as a legitimate proponent of democracy in Asia and abroad changing?
Yes, absolutely. As I said to some degree in my remarks, the combination of reduced funding and retreat from pro-democracy policies has had a tremendous impact across the board. It has emboldened autocratic leaders. It has weakened civil society. It has led to less support for independent institutions like judiciaries and election commissions. And in many cases, it has allowed autocrats to be much more blatant and bold in their repression of civil society, political opposition, the media. It's also put American NGOs, what's happening in our country has put American organizations like IFES and others in a sometimes quite awkward position where we are working in countries in Asia, say, and there may well be an understandable question among some of our interlocutors. You're from the United States. Look at all the problems you're having. Who are you to come here and tell us how to run our democracy? And what's very interesting is that for many years during IFAS's first 30 years or so, um, the approach to democracy support around the world by the US and others was very much, oh, we in North America, Europe, have figured democracy out and we have the answers, and we're going to go and share those answers with all of you who want to be democratic. You have the problems, we have the answers, we'll help. Um, in 1988 or 92, you could sort of understand that. But now the threats to democracy have become much more common. Uh, Tactics of autocrats, all the things I've been talking about, misinformation and disinformation. Um, while at the same time, we see some countries in Asia and Africa developing really good democratic practices. And instead of this vertical conversation, it's a much more horizontal conversation where we all have a set of our own problems and we all have a set of good practices. And so it's for IFAS and others, it's very important how we approach our work, how we approach the conversation with our interlocutors. And it certainly can't be from a point of we have all the answers. The last observation I'll make in answering that question is, while I've never heard it myself, I can guarantee you that Chinese and Russian officials are in the offices of ministers of interior, prime ministers, and other senior government officials, whispering to them, why are you letting these American organizations come in and tell you how to run things? You should follow our model. It's a much better one for you.
Thanks. Wonder if you could reflect on what you see from your practitioner's seat as the reason for the timing of this change in autocratization in the region. Like, I mean, do you see this as something that's driven by decisions of individual leaders, that's driven by big changes in technology or in the economy? How do you think about why we're seeing this pattern now so widely across the region and across the globe?
Uh, it's a pattern that has been growing over time, as some of those statistics I mentioned indicate. Uh, I think it's very contextual in individual countries. It really depends. We saw very big protests in Thailand, and time and again, an opposition party, voted into power and then not allowed to assume the reins of power, or maybe only assumed them briefly, and then there was a blowback to the entrenched powers. The country context matters. It can be a spark that lights the flame. I think recent history in Bangladesh could be very, very different if Sheikh Hasina had not overplayed her hand in August of 2024. It could have been very different in Nepal if the internet hadn't been shut down. So small events, individual leaders, either on the side of those with the power or on civil society side, can really make a difference. And so there's not one clear explanation. It's so context specific, and depending upon these individual factors, which could really go either way. Thailand could have gone very differently. Myanmar could have. So it's hard to attribute one set of factors to why things are happening more broadly.
We've got a couple of questions in here that relate to the status of democracy in the United States and lessons learned from IFAS's work about what we're seeing in this country right now. Obviously, IFAS is an international organization for the most part, but I think that it's fair to ask, do you see some of the symptoms of backsliding in American democracy right now? And then on the positive side of the conversation, do you see potential tactics that have strengthened democracy in some of the other settings where you've worked as being relevant? One questioner here references, for instance, pushback at the state level, right, at the level of state government is playing a positive guardrail role when national dynamics are challenging. So both on the challenges and potential opportunities side here at home, how does your work guide your analysis?
Yeah. So just to be clear, IFAS is an organization that works abroad. We don't work in the United States. We have a bipartisan board. We don't get involved in politics in the United States. Um, I will point out just the fact that the VDEM report that I've been previously citing has moved the United States from a liberal democracy to an electoral democracy, which reflects a bunch of data and analysis by academic experts. Um, we all are aware of some of the attacks against courts, some of the attacks against media outlets. There was news today of the director of the FBI suing a news outlet. So some of those plays in the playbook that I mentioned, we're seeing some of those here in the United States. But we are seeing independent institutions like the courts stand up in many cases. The state, we have a very different form of government than most other countries, so the states do have an important role. Uh, Civil society, um, people's voices, the media, all these, as I said in my remarks, elections aren't stolen on election day. It's everything that's happening now and beforehand. And we are seeing some of those same dynamics at play in our country, and I know we all hope that the norms, the bounds, the laws, the Constitution of our country will continue to really do a great job preserving its democracy.
Right, we have a couple of upvotes here also for a question about livelihood. I assume thought of mostly in economic terms and democracy and autocracy in Asia. Do you see arguments being made about forms of authoritarianism that are more acceptable because of the livelihood of citizens that they deliver um, in a time when democratic systems are not working for the average people, or not delivering on what they're supposed to be delivering for quality of life in the settings? Somebody's worked on world food programs, for instance. How important concerns about basic access to food, basic access to the necessities of life are to how people evaluate their political systems. And how do you see that sort of economic satisfaction aspect playing out in debates in the region?
I think there are probably scholars who can give you a more technical response, but it's my strong belief that in Asia and in democracies, elections around the world, pretty much every single time, the single most important issue will be economics, will be the pocketbook. If people can't feed their kids, they're going to vote for someone who says they'll help them feed their kids. It's as simple as that. And that's often the economic messaging is often combined with an anti-corruption messaging. And those two, whether it's in the United States, we've seen many politicians use those messages. Asia, Africa, they are going to, in almost all cases, be the most or it might not be what politicians always talk about, where we've seen that in the United States, but it's what voters vote on. And politicians who don't get that, I think, are going to see the results at the ballot box.
All right, I think we're coming up to our time. I mean, we can't get to every question, but I do want to ask you maybe to wrap up with when you look across the region or across the globe as IFAS works right now, where do you see the kind of optimism? What's one pinpoint that you would point towards? You've mentioned a couple of the cases where we've seen some protest that has led to transition. When you have those days when programs are not getting funded and when dynamics seem to be going in the wrong direction, what cases or what trends help you capture that optimism and energy about the future of your work?
It's it's a combination or two things really. It's civil servants like who work in election commissions who are so dedicated to their work under so much pressure. They have very difficult jobs and they're so committed to doing what's right for their democracy. And then secondly, civil society or people at large, and particularly youth who are unwilling to accept what they've been told is supposed to be the way society works, and they have to wait their turn. And we saw that in the examples I mentioned. And youth are using technology in a very innovative way. In Nepal, after the protest, they had to the opposition had to come up with a name for who would be leader of the interim government, and they used a voting system on Discord, which is essentially like a gaming chat app that probably less than 5 people in this room have ever used, myself included. But it shows how, and I mentioned the reinventing democracy. Youth are going to find ways to mobilize and make changes that they are demanding for a better life for their future, because they feel they've been let down, whether it's the economy or climate or other issues. And the youth are really a source of inspiration in the United States and in many countries around the world.
Well, thanks so much, Tony. We could continue this conversation all night.